Hi, my name is John Constantinide, and I'm doing my follow-up video for The Line, the men's Bible study for today on April 5th, 2010. Today, we looked at Paul's letter to the Corinthians, first letter in chapter 9. And the focus of the Bible study was on our rights as people and as apostles of Christ versus our mission from God. And what Paul talks about in this chapter is really what we're entitled to as people. And he starts out by saying we're entitled to food, drink, and marrying. And we can even elaborate on that where we're entitled in this country to a right to vote, right to free speech, right to protest, as in giving grievances to our government in a peaceful manner and a lot of other rights that we have in this country at least. And one thing that you may want to inquire about, reflectively, what other rights do we have, and how do you cherish them? How do we cherish them as Christians? And then Paul goes on to talk about in the chapter how we sow spiritual seed and we're entitled to some material rights. Like, for example, when you maybe have some money, you're giving some gas money to someone because you have some spare change. You have blessed someone with that little bit of money, and God in turn will bless you with that material good. And that's a material right that we have as an apostle of Christ. We also have spiritual rights as well, where when we bless others spiritually, we also are blessed spiritually. And when we build others up spiritually or help others spiritually, we are also helped spiritually. And one example would be the soap readings that we have, the daily Bible readings, where maybe you could do a soap reading with a friend that you have. And not only will that friend benefit from you reading with them and I guess encouraging them to read 2 chapters or 4 chapters, however many chapters from the Bible, they also benefit from, I guess, your reflections on that. And you also benefit from their reflections on the chapters that you read. So, in a sense, that's where two friends or several friends commune together and dive into the Word, maybe witness together, maybe evangelize together, and they not only build each other up, but also carry out God's will and become more aware of God. Well, Paul says that even though we have material rights and spiritual rights as apostles of Christ, we should be focused on getting the spiritual rights because that's really what's going to feed us. And Paul says this in the 13th verse. Don't you know that those who work in the temple get their food from the temple, and those who serve at the altar share in what is offered on the altar? In the same way, the Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should receive their living from the gospel. And that basically is a reiteration of Jesus in response to the devil tempting him with bread, saying, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from God. And in the same respect, we should be living not on bread alone, but primarily on God's word, feeding off of that, having that nourish us, having that build us up. And then Paul goes on in the chapter to talk about how, yes, even though as apostles of Christ we do have these rights, he denies himself these rights because he differentiates rights from the mission from God. And that's where Paul does the contrast and where Paul even goes on a limb and says, you know what? I'm going to deny myself these rights because I do not want to be distracted from my mission. That doesn't necessarily mean we have to do that. We have material needs, we have spiritual needs, and oftentimes those are needed for us to complete God's mission for us or God's will for us. But Paul wanted to make a point. He wanted to make a point to the Corinthians that God's mission for him to preach the gospel was so important that he would put aside his own rights, what he is entitled to, in order to have God's work be done. And he even says in verse 16, "Yet when I preach the gospel, I cannot boast, for I am compelled to preach." And then he says before that, "I would rather die than have anyone deprive me of this boast." And he's writing of this boast of his, I guess, self-denial of rights. So we have to ask ourselves, what is God's will? Are we focused on God's will? And what's distracting us from God's will? And then Paul ends off in the chapter talking about how carrying out God's mission is like doing a marathon. And we need to prepare for God's will, God's mission, being a long-term mission. Not just take care of the short-term objectives, but also the long-term objectives that come along with it. And we have to prepare ourselves appropriately for that. So that's my follow-up video for the Bible study. Come out next time if you didn't already, 7 o'clock Mondays at my place. Talk to you later. Peace.